So we're at step one. You've been let go. And the first thing that we need to do is tie up the loose ends and close the chapter on this particular work experience. Now, the first thing that I need you to do is get very clear on the agreement or terms of your termination. So you're going to want to sit down either with HR or the hiring manager, whoever's letting you go doing the terminating, and get very clear on what's happening. Will you be given any money, any severance? Are you eligible to go straight to unemployment? Usually you are when you're being let go, but sometimes there's grounds for you not to be. You're going to want to get clear on that based on your state's ruling. You're going to want to understand what the company is going to say about your employment should somebody call for a reference check. So you have to ask about that because you're going to apply for new jobs and they're going to want a reference check at your employer. And so you have to know who they can contact, and you want to ask specifically what will be said about you. And then lastly, once you understand that, you want to figure out what is the policy with you being able to stay in contact with fellow employees. So just make sure that the company is very clear and has all of that in writing for you with this termination so that you can tie up those loose ends, have your point of contacts, and also know how reference checks can be done in the future. That'll make it easier for you to be able to leave and not have to keep going back to the employer and asking more questions, because you really do want to put this chapter behind you. Now, we talked about the reference check process. This is an area that is of specific concern, and I really want you to take the worksheet that we've included for you and make sure that you get all of the questions on this worksheet answered by the right contact. With the reference check process, it can get a little dicey because there are legal rules out there that say that a company can't say really negative or bad things about you that are untrue, right? That would be slander. And so many companies adopt a no reference policy. And you may hear this from your employer. And what they say is, we will not give a reference. We will not talk about your performance. All we will do is give the dates of employment, when you started and when you ended, and what you made when you started and when you ended, what your salary requirements are. But there is one other question they can ask, which is, are you eligible for rehire? And if an employer asks that, a potential employer, they could say yes or no. That would not be slander. That would be a fact. But imagine what happens if they say, no, you're not eligible for rehire. And that's why it's important that you understand this, because you can't go out there and lie about being fired. If you do, and then somebody calls up and does a reference check on you, and they hear that you're not eligible for rehire, they know something's up and they're going to assume you lied. So again, go through the reference check checklist. Make sure you ask all the questions, that you have a very clear understanding of not just who to contact with references when employers want to check, but exactly what will be said about you. You need to know this and understand this and prepare for it so that you can deal with this as you go forward. Now, the last thing that I want you to think about is confidentiality agreements. In some cases, the firing or the separation of employee and employer can get a little dicey, and your employer might put in front of you a separation agreement or a termination agreement that says that you are not able to disclose anything about this termination. You're not allowed to talk about the specifics of what happened. You're not allowed to talk about if you received any severance. These are usually those stickier situations. Be very, very careful before you sign something like this. Consult a lawyer. In my experience, when you sign something like this, then you're beholden to never talk about the employer. You're not able to say anything. But imagine how that looks when you go into an interview. It looks very suspect. Meanwhile, they're still allowed to call over and do a reference check on you, and if they hear you're not eligible for rehire, guess who looks like they're at fault? So these non-disclosure agreements, these privacy agreements, they're really tricky, and you really want to make sure before you sign anything like that that you've consulted a lawyer. Companies will sometimes fire you and offer you money to sign that separation agreement, and you may think it's a great idea and want to take the money, but you have to think about the impact of that agreement later on when you're trying to get hired by somebody else. So that's it. Make sure that you tie up all the loose ends upon your departure. Figure out who you can contact, get very clear on the reference check process, what will be said and how to go about it, and please think twice before you sign any kind of non-disclosure or privacy agreements, because again, they could really hurt you in the long run.